Everybody loves a good RPG. People will say, I don't like RPGs, but they do like RPGs. That's a fact. Maybe the ones they like aren't turn-based, but whatever. The point is, you love RPGs and I love RPGs. I talk about RPGs all the time. Let's talk about them some more. They're pretty much all I play anyway. What, did you think this was a fighting game channel or something? And villains! The antagonistic force of an RPG can often make or break it. Kefka, Laja, Kuja, Asgore, Porky. These characters are all iconic and some of the best villains ever. Hell, even some of the minor villains can be great sometimes, especially comedic ones, like Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V, who's one of the best characters in any video game I've ever played. But I won't be talking about Gilgamesh today. He's too amazing to fall into the category that I'm discussing here. Though he's comedic, his depth and complexity are too great for me to lump him in with other comedic villains. Today I'm talking about how when it comes to fandom there's a lot of racism and misogyny and how these kinds of characters are interpreted. Because goofy RPG villains are beloved by many fans, until they're brown women. Yep, that's right. You thought I was done talking about my favorite donut from Omori? Well, you'd be wrong. There's always more Omori donut discourse to talk about. And today, let's look at how she's hated while other villains aren't. So, Sweetheart is one of the main villains in the game, Omori, and she's a comedically narcissistic person who does some pretty terrible things over the course of the game, like, I don't know, torturing people to death, for example, I guess. She's also just generally annoying, I suppose. I mean, people say this, but I don't know, I find her self-obsession charming and cute. Confidence never hurt anyone. People hate her supposedly for her narcissistic tendencies and her genuinely awful crimes against humanity, but then you look at other villains like her, and I don't think that's the case. Well, I think people hate her because she's a girl and because she has dark skin. Let's look at some examples of other villains who aren't dark-skinned or women, but have still committed several atrocities and are loved instead of hated. Chrono Trigger. I've talked about it on and on. Everybody loves it. It's a near-flawless game to me. Like, if I were to cite an example of the perfect RPG to you, Chrono Trigger would be the first on the list, even though it's not my favorite. And most people love the joke villain of Ozzy that's in the game, including myself. I love Ozzy. However, Ozzy is just as bad as Sweetheart, if not worse. He tries to take over the entire world and commit mass genocide on the entirety of the human species, for God's sake. He comes pretty close to exceeding, though not because of his own actions, of course. He's kind of a dunce. Thanks for that one, Magus. Not only that, he thinks he's the greatest general ever and one of the most powerful mages of all time. He constantly touts his intelligence, which obviously isn't actually present, considering how you defeat him by hitting a lever to make a hole appear beneath him. Does that mean you're not allowed to think he's funny? Of course not. I think he's funny as hell. Chrono Trigger's dynamic sprite expressions and witty writing contribute to that a lot. It's a funny game. What I'm saying is that Ozzy is nowhere near as hated as Sweetheart in fan communities and is instead treated as funny like Sweetheart should be as well, despite the fact that he exhibits all the same traits as her that Omori fan communities pretend to loathe. Another good example is Ultros from Final Fantasy VI. Ultros is an octopus who's a sexual predator. He's a beloved character despite him being a total sleazeball that every female character he encounters, yes, even the 13-year-old girl realm. However, people are just able to ignore that, I guess, because he's a haha funny octopus. Final Fantasy VI is one of my favorite games of all time, but the GBA version's take on Ultros is gross and is one of the many reasons I prefer the SNES version tenfold. In the SNES version, him being a pervert is toned down massively due to the different and arguably censored translation. That being said, people love him regardless of translation, every community I've ever been in dedicated to Final Fantasy. These same people would hate Sweetheart because, again, despite them both being obnoxious, and Sweetheart being the less terrible of the two, she's a brown woman. Another good example from the same series, though not quite as potent, is Reno from Final Fantasy VII. Reno's in a weird place with me. The game doesn't seem like it wants me to take him seriously, but there are also a few scenes where it seems like it does want us to take him seriously. In one part of the game, when you're saving another member of his organization, one of your party members, he's treated as a serious character that you're supposed to respect, even though you disagree with him because he's setting aside his differences to help you in the same capacity. But in another part of the game, you see him talking to his friend Rude about who they have a crush on, and I mean, the scene's just very silly. It's a funny scene, don't get me wrong, but like, I just don't know what the game wants me to think of this guy. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that he's a bit of a joke villain as well, because he doesn't really do much throughout the game. Much like the others, he's also a pretty terrible person. I mean, he works for an evil corporation that's literally sucking the planet's soul out, and doesn't really seem to have any qualms about that at all. I can't think of a single point in the game where he has any internal debate about this or anything. However, people love him. I guess he does have kind of a redemption, but I'm pretty sure it's in the Advent Children sequel movie and not even the original game. I haven't even seen Advent Children, so I have no idea. Even still, he literally drops the roof of an entire city on its residents, the Sector 7 plate, on top of Sector 7. He fucking kills like at least 100,000 people. I understand he was just acting under orders or whatever, but I don't give a shit. Since he's cool and a guy and he's white, people just think that it's okay that he did all that. But if Sweetheart did the same thing, there would be riots. Sweetheart is by no means a perfect character. She's haughty, she's impulsive, and she's done a lot of really terrible things. But she's funny and she's likable. There's a disproportionately large number of people who hate her regardless of her being a character with an interesting and tragic backstory with some really genuine comedic moments. She was a donut person who came from nothing and was suddenly given everything she wanted except for love. It's honestly really sad to see her never find the love she wants. And I mean, her entire castle is full of funny digs at her, like her poetry book full of vapid nonsense you can find in her bedroom, or how she reacts to being rejected by Hero both times in overly dramatic ways. She's fun. Since people don't hate other likable and funny villains who've also done terrible things, I posit that the hatred stems not from her doing terrible things, but because, again, she's a brown woman. Ozzy, Ultros, and Reno are not female characters, and they get endless praise. The last of them is white. It might not even be something people realize consciously. Implicit bias is something that exists due to us living in a patriarchal and racist society where women of color are not often in positions of power. Those two aspects compounded make it so she's naturally more hated by the community, even if they don't realize it, because she's a powerful woman of color and that's uncomfortable for them. Of course, there's also the fact that the gaming community itself has fostered a massively and openly misogynistic and reactionary base after the events of Gamergate in 2014. An entire movement with the express purpose of targeting women in the gaming industry will do that to a community. But that's its own rabbit hole of information that I honestly don't feel like getting into today. The point is, Sweetheart is a character who doesn't deserve most of the hatred she gets, as most of the hatred she gets is due to her status as a person of color and as a woman. Other comedic RPG villains who commit atrocities don't get nearly the same treatment in their game's respective fanbases despite being far worse people. And frankly, that just upsets me a little bit. This has been Arcade and Everlasting, Jelly-Filled Donut, signing off. Thank you for watching.